What is up, people? My name is Tim Buell, and today we're doing Mix Tutorial 2.0. If you go 2 years back on this channel, you'll see a mix tutorial I did, and it's very, very long, and I do think it's helpful, but in the last 2 years, almost everything about how I mix has changed. I'm not a professional mix engineer. I am a drummer by trade, and all of the stuff I do in my studio that I send to producers and artists, that gets mixed by real professional mixing engineers. But I do mix for myself a lot for all the things that I put out onto the internet, and I also help other creators mix their stuff. So I do know something about mixing, and I want to give you all what I've learned in the last 2 years since I made the first mix tutorial. The biggest thing is that every mix is different. Every drum, microphone setup, and studio, and everything is always different. So if I can get you in and show you each track, what each track is doing, I think you'll be able to kind of maybe gather the bigger workflow things, and then just getting into my brain about like how I did each thing in here. I think that'll be more helpful, getting that kind of insight than like 5 tips to the perfect mix. Let's get into it. So let me just play to you the drum mix as it is, and then we'll dive into like how I arrived at where I'm at. Here is the totally raw drum tracks. So cool. I really like this drum mix, and let's get into how I got to it. First of all, I'm gonna go ahead and mute hi-hat, the crotch mic, which we'll get to, and then the 2 room mics, because they end up coloring a lot of the sound, and I don't necessarily, like, not everyone's gonna have these, and they're mixed kind of hot right now because of what I do with compression and stuff with them. So when I start soloing stuff, it'll sound weird if those are left in because they're louder than they would be in the final mix. I'm also going to mute this smack, which we'll get to. But here are kind of the main drum sounds soloed out. So this is with no EQ, no compression, no nothing. This is overheads, toms, snare, and kick mics. I have a kick in, a kick out, a snare top, a snare bottom, rack, floor, and overhead. So here is all of that with no processing at all. And I'm going to turn the bus processing off too. So that's a pretty good, I mean, it sounds like drums in a room. That's a pretty good sounding drum feel. The first thing I do is I run all of my inputs to a drum bus. That is this right here. And then on the drum bus, what I have here is an EQ where I'm just knocking off a little bit of the like really lows, because those will change how this compressor acts. Then I have a compressor going, and it's not crazy slammed. It's like a 3-to-1 ratio, and it's just grabbing some of the like louder kick, snare, tom hits and like kind of squeezing them down a little bit. And then I have 2 EQs. They're both waves EQs. You could use any EQ, but basically with this first EQ, I'm adding a little bit of low end and a little bit of like high end shimmer. And then with the second EQ, I'm scooping out some of the cloudy mid-range stuff, and then I'm boosting a little bit at 1K and a little bit at 1.5K. So here is what the mix bus does. So again, this is the overheads, rack, floor, snare, kick, all of that sent to a bus, and then I'm just applying this compression and EQ stuff to those signals. So nothing super dramatic. It's just kind of shaping the drum sound just a little bit so that we're a little bit closer to, kind of where we're going to end up, so that when I start doing some mixing on the actual individual channels, like this mix bus is kind of like shaped a little bit to how I want the drum sounds to be when we get there. So that's kind of the first thing. Route everything to the mix bus and then shape the mix bus just a little bit. Some light compression, some basic EQ moves to just clean stuff up and get it sounding a little more polished than just like totally raw mics. Then the next move is I'm going to unmute everything. The next move, and I'm gonna turn off all this stuff. I'm gonna leave the mix bus moves there. So the EQ and compression on the mix bus, I'm gonna leave there. So everything we hear will also be sending to this bus where it's, a little bit compressed and a little bit of EQ. But the next move is to go through each individual channel and set a gate. So gates are super, super, super important. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn all of this stuff on for the drums. So this is pretty much the full mix. This first insert right here are gates. I really, really like the Fab Filter Pro G because you can actually pick the range that it listens to for how to, you can set your threshold and do all the stuff you normally do. And it's got a lot of look ahead time, which is great for drums. But this little thing down here, you can set a range of frequencies that you want it to look for to get keyed. And that is like really, really important and helpful. So this whole first slot here, all of these across here are just Pro G, that gate running on all the kick mics, all the snare mics, the rack toms, and then even the crotch mic and the room mic. So what I'll do is I'll play the mix with the gates enabled and then I'll bypass them. And you'll hear how much when I take these gates off, how much just like noise and air and kind of like rumbly stuff shows up. So here is the drums with the gates enabled. And this is them bypassed. So man, when you take off those gates, there is just so much noise coming through. And I'll turn everything off while we can go through this one by one. But with the rack tom and floor tom especially, when I play these mics without the gate, you can just hear that's all. I'm not even playing toms. That's tom mics. And when I turn these gates on, all of that cloudy, just rumbly stuff goes away. And you only hear those mics open up when they need to. So the first thing I do is make sure that I set gates for everything so that I just take care of all those problems. That's also what allows me if I solo out the snare drum. Snare drum sounds awesome, but there's a lot of kick and a lot of hi-hat. So putting that gate on really, really, tightens things up. And I have, all those ghost notes are getting gated out, but I have the crotch mic, I have some of the room mics. Like I have a lot of ways that I can get those ghost notes in there. It doesn't all have to come from the snare top mic. This mono room mic, that has a gate on it that actually, doesn't, when it closes, it doesn't close all the way because this room mic adds a lot of girth and craziness to the kick drum, but I don't want it rumbling around all the time. So if I take this gate off, that gate is acting less of a cut off completely and let's just tame the areas where the kick or snare isn't playing. Because I like the color and the vibe that this far room mic gives to the drums. But if I leave it wide open, it just starts to like muddy things up. So I got the mix bus, I got my gate set. The next thing is do basic compression and EQ on each track. So this is gonna be a little different depending on the kind of sounds you're going for or whatever. But what I'll do is I'll go through and I'll enable, I'll play the mix, leave this mix bus stuff on here, leave these gates on here. I'll play the mix and then enable the compression, and then I'll enable the EQ on everything, and you can hear the difference it makes. So that EQ, that compression that I just enabled right there really just makes things start hitting harder, makes things more aggressive, and it thickens some things up. So that's really what's going on with this compression. And because I have gate set and stuff, I can be a little more, colorful with how I'm compressing stuff, because I'm not compressing all this other garbage because the gates are clearing up a lot of that. And now here's like the first round of EQ. So the biggest thing with this compression is adding the smack and the thickening that I want to do. And then with all of these EQ moves, I'm just trying to make room for everything that I need to include in here. So, these overheads have a mid-range boost and a top-end boost to add some air, but I'm kind of scooping out a lot of the low lows, and then I'm scooping out some of the mids and the mid lows because I have a bunch of close mics that are going to do that. I don't need that stuff in here. For the hi-hat, this one is really aggressive. I'm really clearing everything out under 350 hertz. I just don't need that stuff from my hi-hat mic. And you can hear the difference that makes. There's just so much extra low-end weird stuff that I don't need it. So I clear it up. For the kick in mic, I'm boosting a little bit of the lows, but just a little bit, scooping out some mid-range and then adding some clicky attacks. So the kick in mic. Just kind of beefing it up. The kick out mic is really where we're getting a lot of low end. So this move here, scooping out some of this high end that I'm getting from the kick in mic, clearing up these low mid stuff, and then snare top mic, kind of boosting at the fundamental, taking out some weird ringy stuff, and then adding a little bit of bite to it up here. Snare bottom, pretty boring. It's just scooping out a lot of the low rumbly stuff and then adding a little bit of high end. For the rack tom, boosting a little bit of the low, scooping out some thuddy, weird mid-range stuff. Probably similar thing on the floor tom. Yep, almost the same move on the floor tom. Overheads we went over, hi-hat we went over. So this crotch mic, this is where it starts to get interesting. Let me solo this crotch mic. This is what it sounds like with no kind of plugins running on it. So again, this gate is not closing all the way. It's simply just opening up a lot on the kick and the snare, and then kind of coming back down for the hi-hat stuff, because I don't necessarily want the hi-hat vibe this has. I just want the kick and snare kind of. That gate kind of just tightens it up, and then I'm compressing it. So what I'm doing with this EQ, and this is really kind of, this makes this crotch mic work, is I'm clearing out all these lows and stuff. I have a bunch of other places I'm getting low and kind of that. This is a ton of mid-range and kind of carving off a little bit of the top end because I want this to act as glue. So in a lot of these close mics, I had to kind of scoop out some of the mid-range or some of the mid-lows and stuff because it just doesn't sound good. This mic serves as like glue. It's a little trashy and it just kind of sits in where no other mic is, and it kind of fills in some of those holes that I'm kind of taking out of other mics. For the room mic, I'm doing some pretty aggressive compression, and then again, I'm adding some air with the room mic, adding some mid-range with the room mic, and then leaving the lows kind of just like there, but not enhancing them, scooping out some of that cloudy stuff. And then the room mono mic, again, I have that gate kind of ducking it when it's not kick and snare hits. And then for this, clearing up a bunch of those lows. And then I'm boosting this like 34 subby thing, and I'm boosting the top end. So that's kind of what I'm doing on all of the basic compression and EQ. Again, we'll go from no compression and EQ to compression and EQ. So really, that compression and EQ is the bulk of the mixing. The compression is adding some thickness and some thwack to stuff, and then that EQ is just clearing up kind of the stuff that's distracting and the stuff that making everything play nice with each other. So step 1, get the mix bus set up, shape the overall drum sound. Step 2, set your gates and all that stuff. Step 3, go to each individual channel, get your compressor and EQ and get all that situated. And then this last kind of round of stuff here is just kind of coloration and adding vibe to things I think could use it. So for example, on the kick out mic, that's a cool sound, but I kind of want it to have a little more attitude and a little more sub stuff. So I have this plugin called Saturn. It adds multi-band distortion and saturation. So I'm not doing a ton with the lows, but with the mids, I'm kind of driving it way more. And I'll play this with Saturn off at first, and then I'll turn it on. And what this EQ after it is doing is just kind of shaping, after Saturn, it's kind of shaping, boosting a little bit of the low and a little bit of the mid-range. But I'll turn these on after you hear it for a little bit, and you'll see what it kind of does. It colors it in a different way that I couldn't really do just with EQ. That's with it off, and here it is on. So it's still on here. So with it on, it just has more mid-range and has more kind of snap and attack and kind of in-your-faceness. For the color that I'm doing on the rack and floor tom, I have Saturn on there too, and I'm doing a similar thing. I'm just adding some mid-range kind of bark to it. Let me find a place where I'm playing toms. Just kind of adding some attack and some bark to it. I'm doing a similar thing with the hi-hat. I hate EQing hi-hat. This has a nice way of, let me get this cycle bar. Has a way of taking out some of those lows and adding some like nice color and kind of grit to the hi-hat. And it adds presence without becoming harsh and too bright. I find with hi-hats, when you start cranking the high end, it just gets awful. So that in context. Just brings the hi-hat more forward and a little color. On the overheads, the only coloration type thing I'm doing is I'm widening the overheads a little bit with this ozone imager. Makes the overheads just a little bit wider. Here's it off, and then I'll turn it on. Just opens up the hi-hats and makes them sound a little bit wider, which is nice. Step 5 is working on parallel processes. So this smack channel here, the only two things going to this smack channel are the kick in mic and the snare top mic. So let me solo this track. So really all I'm doing with this parallel channel is sending kick and snare to it, and I am just making sure that it kind of accentuates and makes snare and kick just sound as, you know, full as they can. So I'll play the mix with this muted, and then I'll unmute it, and I think you'll hear what it does to listen for how it thickens out the kick and the snare. This is with it off. Here's it on. Here's it on. So that low end of the snare that I'm adding right here really just makes the snare sound much more forward in the mix. Makes it sound like the snare is much, much closer. As we're talking about parallel processing, what I hear a lot of people on YouTube, Instagram, whatever doing is using way too much reverb. So what I hear from a lot of people is reverb that sounds like this. Don't do it. A lot of times I think this is a result of not having the best sounding room, or maybe not recording things in the best way. And reverb like that can be a way to just kind of consume and fill up a ton of space and say, my snare doesn't sound that good. I don't know how to make it sound great, so I'll throw this reverb on there. But I've never been in a room where the drums sounded like this. I don't particularly love reverb like that. It's just swimming in reverb. Reverb, I think, is one of those things that you should, when it's happening, it sounds great. And then when you mute it, you go, oh, I didn't even realize there was reverb. So it's one of those things that you don't hear it or notice it until it's gone. So if I were going to do reverb on a track like this, it would sound a lot more like this. So this reverb, again, I'll solo it. This is the Abbey Road's Chambers. This is one of my favorite drum reverbs because it models Abbey Road's actual rooms. So when you put your drums in this reverb, and I really like this stone room for drums, it just sounds like drums in a room. And I think that's what reverb's supposed to sound like. A lot of times when it sounds like outer space, I just think, what are we doing? So this adds just a little bit of length to the toms and a little bit of like glue to stuff and a little bit of just, ambient swimming around, but it's not drowning the drums. So here it is soloed, and then I'll put it in context of the mixed. Here it is without it. So it just adds a little bit of fatness and just kind of goodness. And then this EQ I put after it because it just had this very clicky, weird sound coming from it, so that I just scooped that out. So that's pretty much it. You got your mix bus, you've got your gates to clear stuff up, you've got your EQ and compression on the channels. Then you add your coloration, then you add any parallel processing you do. And then on your stereo bus, You can, this is kind of icing on the cake. What I do is I do multi-band compression. I do some limiting. And then I have the U-Lean loudness meter showing me how loud things are. Basically, this multi-band compressor is just one last round of compression to glue and tie things overall together. And it allows you, depending on where you set these crossover points, to kind of adjust the overall mix of highs versus mids versus low mids versus lows. This limiter is just making things as loud as, I want them. And then when I'm playing through the U-Lean loudness meter, I'm really looking at this true peak max right here. And I just want to make sure that this is like -1 or -1.5. So that's pretty much it. I mean, you've got your mix bus happening. Then you've got your gates, you've got your compression, you've got your EQ, you've got your coloration, you have your parallel processing, and then you throw a little bit of sauce on your master bus, and you're good to go. So what I'll do here is the totally raw drum tracks. And then here is the fully mixed drum tracks. And that's it.